Ladies and gentlemen, this Sunday, of course, Resurrection Sunday, the central holiday, holy day for Christianity for good reason, because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity's true. If he didn't rise from the dead, game over, it's false. What we're going to talk about today is actually something that you had written in one of the surveys for our podcast. And that is, someone said, hey, can you do a program on the Crusades? And so I said, oh, yeah, I got a perfect guy to do that. That'd be the great Bill Federer. And then somebody else said, can you do one on the Inquisition? Well, again, we've got Bill Federer. I know we're coming up to Resurrection Sunday. We'll talk about the resurrection again here soon. But I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the Inquisition because it's tax day, April 15th, talk about an Inquisition. You guys know Bill Federer. He's an amazing historian. He's written so many great books. He's going to join us for the entire time today. So here he is, ladies and gentlemen. The great Bill Federer. He's coming to us from some sort of hotel in Virginia Beach as we speak. Bill, how are you?
Hey, Frank, great to be with you.
It's always great being with you because our listeners love the podcast that you do with me, not because I'm doing anything, but because you're doing all the work. I just ask you one question and then boom, we've got the whole history. Before I get to a question about the Inquisition, friends, I want to mention that next week I will be at UT, Lord willing, UT Knoxville, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. That's on the 23rd of April. That's a Wednesday night, just after Resurrection Sunday. It's open to the public, and it will also be live streamed, so check that out. That's our last university for this semester. We're getting close to finals time. You can't do it, obviously, after that or during finals time. But, Bill, the Inquisition is something that a lot of people have questions about. And a lot of people think hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the Inquisition. The Inquisitions go from somewhere around 1100 in the 1100s to say the 1500s, although apparently the Spanish Inquisition went a little bit further. Can you kind of give us an overview of the Inquisitions? And then we're going to go in several different directions to get some proper context. So start out with the Inquisitions that were ordered by, say, the Spanish.
Right. So you have Ferdinand and Isabella marry, and then they begin to drive the Muslims out of Spain. It was a 700-year process to drive the Muslims out of Spain. In the year 711 is when Tariq landed at Jabal, a mountain, and they called it Jabal Tariq or Gibraltar. And in 10 years conquered all of Spain, but it took 700 years to drive them out. Finally did with Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, lots of Muslims were known to pretend like they were peaceful and then would plot to do assassinations. In recent history, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by fundamentalist Muslims in his own Egyptian military. King Abdullah of Jordan was assassinated by fundamentalist Muslims, and he was a moderate Muslim. And so you saw lots of kings assassinated in the century leading up to this. 1206, Philip of Swabia, a German kingdom, was assassinated. Christopher I of Denmark was poisoned and killed. Eric I of Denmark assassinated. The King of Hungary and kings of Poland and Naples and Muslim sultans were assassinated. Murad I. And anyway, so there is the thought that Ferdinand, even though he drove the Muslims out, there may still be some staying. And so he had a Grand Inquisitor, what a name, named Torquemada. That name even sounds bad. And so Torquemada led the Grand Inquisition between 1482 and 1498. Torquemada was a key player in the Alhambra Decree of 1492 that forced all the Jews to convert or leave. And so lots of Jews left. Some went to the Ottoman Empire. Some went to Morocco, to Fez, and later were killed. Some went to Portugal. And then when the King of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of the King of Spain, the King of Spain said, well, you got to drive the Jews out there too. And so then Jews went to the Netherlands. And then from the Netherlands, they went to Recife, South America. And then in the early 1600s, around 1623, the first Jews left Recife, went to Port Royal, Jamaica, and then went to New York, which was a Dutch colony. While the Jews were in the Netherlands, they settled in Leiden, and that's where they met the Pilgrims. And so the Pilgrims identified with Jews and would make references to the Jews leaving Egypt and that they fled England, and the Jews wanted to get away from the Pharaoh, and the Pilgrims and Puritans wanted to get away from the King of England. And anyway, so Torquemada would extract confessions. Again, trying to root out if there's somebody that was a Muslim pretending to be a Christian or a Jew. And then there were Jews. So the Jews were called conversos, or the ones that converted to Christianity, or morenos. And those were the Jewish converts to Christianity that were more or less forced to convert. And but for some reason, the king thought that maybe they were saying that they converted, but at home, they were still practicing their Jewish faith. They called them crypto-Jews. And so Torquemada did investigations, and he would extract confessions and would use torture. And it was horrible. It was terrible. And about 2,000 people were killed during this period. And then after the Reformation, the Spanish did these inquisitions against Protestants. And then you had Henry VIII more or less doing the same thing against Catholics and Puritans and Presbyterians. And you start zooming out and you start seeing wherever you have a king, the kings demanded total obedience, like the king of the Roman emperors. They demanded what? They demanded that their image be worshipped. And they literally would force Christians to deny their conscience and take a pinch of incense and worship the statue of Caesar or die. And we trace this back, and it's a little bit uncomfortable, but it's in the Bible, Deuteronomy 13. Moses is giving the law. It says, if a prophet, a dreamer of dreams, arises among you and gives a sign or a wonder, but he tells you, let us go after other gods, which we have not known, and serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet, that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord is testing you. And it says that you shall take that prophet or dreamer of dreams and put him to death.
A capital crime in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, yes.
Right, that's the Old Testament. And and you saw the value of life was a little different back then. Jephthah delivered Israel from their enemies, and some of this one tribe shows up, so well, you didn't ask us, and we're going to burn you and your family because you didn't ask us to help you. And it's like, what a wrong time to nitpick. And so Jephthah found out that the ones that threatened to kill him, they could not pronounce shibboleth, and they would say Sibboleth. And so at a passage of the Jordan River, they'd ask everybody that was passing to say Shibboleth, and if they couldn't, they'd kill them. But this extracting of confessions we saw with Nebuchadnezzar, 605 to 562 BC. Nebuchadnezzar says, everybody has to worship my statue. And I don't care if you have a warm feeling in your heart for my statue, you are going to worship this statue or burn in the fiery furnace. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, King, if we're not going to worship your statue, and if we die, we die. And then, of course, Jesus appeared in the furnace with him. And then you had Saul of Tarsus. So he was an enforcer of the Jewish faith, probably going back to Deuteronomy, and he oversaw the killing of Stephen. And even Saul himself confessed to hunting down Christians and arresting them and having them executed. So it's a terrible, terrible thing. But this is sort of the norm of human history. And so this begins to highlight that Jesus himself said, if you go to a town and they don't receive you, what? Shake the dust and leave.
Yeah, it doesn't say kill them. Right.
Contrast that with Islam, which says go to a town if they don't receive you, wage war on the town. And so we see an outward in or an inward out type of faith. And Jesus and the early church for the first 3 centuries, it was completely inward out. It was, you believe in the kingdom of God is within you. And there was no forcing of people to become Christian because Jesus never forced anybody to follow him. There's even the story of Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes, and a crowd is following him for a free lunch, and they want to make him king. Then they'll have lots of free welfare. And Jesus said, this is not the way it's supposed to happen. And you can't read it any other way than he said something that he knew they would not understand on purpose to shake away those following him for the wrong reasons. And he says, you're following me because of the bread. And then he said, I'm the bread of life. Unless you eat my body, drink my blood, you have no part in me. And they say, this is a difficult saying. Who can bear it? And they walk with him no more. Jesus didn't run after him and say, oh, come on back. You misunderstood me. No, he turns to the 12, says, you want to go too? There's the door. And then Peter said, where else can I go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. Jesus didn't run after him with a sword. In Islam, they have a concept that when you, it's called apostasy laws. And if you leave Islam, then the ummah, the community, kills you. And so sort of like Hotel California, you're free to join, you just can't leave.
It's interesting you mentioned that because my mentor, Dr. Norman Geisler, wrote a book. Originally, I want to say it was about 1993 with a converted Muslim, and he had to write under a pseudonym, Abdul Salib, which means servant of the cross, apparently in Arabic. And the book was called Answering Islam. And then right after 9/11, they updated it. So it came out again, I think, in about 2002 or 3, again, called Answering Islam. And people that do evangelism to Muslims say it's still the best book on the topic. But the co-author of Dr. Geisler couldn't reveal himself because of that I think it's in Surah 3. It says anyone who leaves Islam can and should be murdered. They don't call it murder. It'd be an honor killing, right? You're an apostate, so you should die. Now, as you mentioned earlier, the Old Testament had a similar law in the theocratic nation of Israel. But of course, the Old Covenant now is obsolete, according to Hebrews 8:13. So Jesus has a new way forward. And what's that new way, Bill?
Yeah, well, that is, he's more interested in your heart versus outward compliance. William Penn, who was put in the Tower of London for his faith, he had converted and became Quaker, and he was not an Anglican. And so he was put in the Tower of London. And he said, force makes hypocrites. 'Tis persuasion only that makes converts. Roger Williams, that founded Rhode Island, said enforced uniformity is the cause of persecution of Christ's saints. That this idea that he said you should not use civil government to enforce religious beliefs. And so that's why there's been this pushback to the canceling of people if they don't embrace the trans agenda. It's like, wait a second, America is not founded on you forcing us and our kids to give up our beliefs. So we have the Apostle Paul, and he oversaw the killing of Stephen, and then, of course, he then got saved. But we have 3 centuries of Christians being persecuted, and they never led an armed resistance against the Roman Empire. And there were 9 major persecutions. Nero started the first one, putting Christians in animal skins and putting them in the Colosseum, and then letting lions loose to eat them, and then wrapping them in burlap, dipping them in tar, and putting them on poles in his garden called Nero's torches, and would light them on fire. And but for 3 centuries, now you contrast those first 3 centuries with Islam, and they conquered from Arabia to conquering Egypt, which used to be Christian, evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel. They conquered Syria, which used to be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. They conquered into Armenia, which used to be Christian and still is. It's just whittled down in size. And North Africa used to be Christian. There used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. And So then we see heresies. So Constantine stops the persecution of Christians in 313 AD with the Edict of Milan. And things are fine until Arius, a bishop, starts the Arian heresy and says Jesus is a little less than God. He's a created being, and writes a catchy song. And the Visigoths, who are immigrants into Rome, start converting to Arianism. And it's splitting the church. And since Constantine had made the church, the Christianity, the de facto religion of Rome, it's now splitting the Roman Empire. It's having political fallout. And so Constantine's attitude was, look, Christians, settle this thing now. So Constantine orders and pays for all the bishops of the Christian world to come together for the first time ever. It's called the Council of Nicaea. And about 500 of the bishops and the staff. And so they
325 AD or so, right?
325 AD. Mm-hmm. They excommunicate Arius and they write the Nicene Creed, which is a great creed. It's still said today. And then there's another heresy, another council, and they settle it. Another heresy, another council. And then you have Emperor Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, Italy. The pastor is Bishop Ambrose, St. Ambrose. And so imagine being Ambrose and having the Roman emperor in your church. Well, he's still the emperor, and he decides to outlaw pagan worship in Greece. They have temple prostitutes. They have killing of children called exposure of unwanted infants, and divination, where they cut open an animal and look at its gizzards and try to predict the future, and all this pagan stuff. And so Theodosius, the Roman emperor, gives an order: no more pagan stuff. Well, these Greeks are like, no, we want to keep doing it. So he sends his army over there and kills thousands of them. And Ambrose rebukes Theodosius. There's a famous painting on the steps of this cathedral where Bishop Ambrose is rebuking the emperor, even though that actually didn't happen. But it the setting for it happened, but that encounter portrayed in the picture didn't actually happen. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, the pagan world realized that we have to be Christian. And so they would flood into the church without having a conversion experience. It was just a new state doctrine. And so you began to have some of these pagan trappings begin to come in. And so within a century, you go from Christians in catacombs being thrown to the lions to coming out of the catacombs. And then Constantine had the first basilica, right, a marble church. And then you had this influx of pagans who nominally convert. And then you have the state enforced doctrine. And so the Roman Christians got into a theological difference with the Syrian Christians and excommunicated them. And the Syrians were like, fine, we'll just go east instead of west. Then they had a disagreement with the Egyptian Coptic Christians over a doctrinal thing. And so that's when the Coptics drive out the Byzantines, and then Islam takes advantage of the situation and takes over Egypt. And then you have the Great Schism of 1054 AD.
1054, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Over two words in the Nicene Creed, and Son. So the Nicene Creed says the Holy Spirit, the Catholic West said the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. But the Eastern Orthodox said the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father.
Let's split over that.
They split over it.
They split, East and West. Boom. Okay.
And so that allowed Islam to take over the Byzantine Empire without the West coming to their rescue. Finally, the West came. It's called the Crusades.
And we had a whole show on that. So we don't have to go into the Crusades now, friends, because we're going to get to the Inquisition. But Bill and I just did a show on that about a month and a half ago. So go see the Crusade show. You got to know the context of what's going on in history to understand why there were Crusades, why there's an Inquisition. If you just look at it out of context, you don't really understand what's been going on. Anyway, go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
So now let's take a peek at Islamic Inquisitions. And so the after Muhammad died, a bunch of Muslims wanted to leave, and go back to their old pagan religions. And you had Caliph Abu Bakr, and he decided that you can't go back. And then he waged war and killed a bunch of them that wanted to leave. And so that set in stone in Islam that you're free to join, you just can't leave. And but Islam spread, and then around the year 800 AD, you had some moderate Muslims. One was Al-Farabi and Avicenna, and they would translate Greek classics into Arabic. They would write on medicine and science, and they would write poems, and they would say things like, maybe paradise isn't a sex party with lots of virgins. Maybe it's more of a spiritual thing. And if you were to take a snapshot of the world, you would have thought that the Muslims are about to experience a renaissance. But it all gets slapped down by a guy named Ghazali. He's a mujahideen, a renewer of the faith. And he says, don't study Greek philosophy because you could get pulled into leaving the Islamic faith. And he didn't even want him to study geometry, Greek geometry. And so this began something called the Mihna, M-I-H-N-A, which means ordeal or test. And so around 833 AD, you had a Abbasid caliph named Al-Mamun, A-L-M-A-M-U-N. And so he began to institute this ordeal, this test. And if you didn't pass it, you'd get killed. It was an Islamic Inquisition. And so you began to see that we sort of think of Islam as, one group, but within inside of it, the two main groups are the Sunni and the Shia. So the Shiite go back to Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. So it was originally Shia Ali, party of Ali. And then Muhammad had a general named Abu Bakr, who was fought with Muhammad in every battle. So he knew the way. And so the word for the way is Sunni. And so you had 90% of Muslims are Sunni, and then about 10% are Shiite, which are mostly in Iran. But they would kill each other in violent wars if they didn't believe exactly the same way the other ones did. And then you go back to Europe, and you have in the 1100s, there's a Pope Eugene III, and there's what's called the Cathars. And the Catharism. And these were, it's an area of France where they had different doctrine. Some of it was a little bit off. They were talking about two gods, and the Satan God and the God of the Bible. And, it got off enough so that this Pope Eugene decided to send a bunch of people to the town to evangelize them. And they didn't get evangelized, and one of the people that they sent gets killed. And so now the Pope ratchets it up, and it eventually turned into the Albigensian Crusade. And they sent armies to this area, southern France, and ended up killing a lot of people. So we're just given the history here. This is sort of the way it was. There's 6 stages that I go through in my examination of politics and religion. One is the king is in charge of both church and religion. And that's, the Roman emperor demanded his image be worshipped. Right. And then when Christianity comes along and you have the Pope, we, tend to criticize, but in a sense, it was the first time that you have a religious head different than a government head. And for 1,000 years, that was the case. And then when the Reformation happened, instead of having a Pope ruling top down over the church, you begin to have a covenant form of government in churches. At the same time, providentially, that the printing press was invented and people could read the Bible. And so pastors would teach the people to read the Bible. And once they could read it, then they could be entrusted with getting involved in church leadership. And then so we began to see a church polarity change from a top-down church to a bottom-up church. And then that influenced politics when the Pilgrims and Puritans settled America, and they took their bottom-up church government and turned it into their bottom-up civil government.
Hold the thought there, Bill.
Federal is Latin for covenant.
Hold the thought, because this is interesting. I want our listeners to marinate on this for a minute, because here in the West, where we have this Republican form of government, elected representatives, a president, Congress, and 3 branches of government, and of course now the unofficial 4th branch that's getting doged right now, thankfully. We don't understand history, and we look back on some of these incidents like the Crusades or the Inquisitions, and as terrible as they were, since we don't understand the context, we can't imagine how these things could have been ever even conceived of. But there are reasons why there were Crusades, as we talked about in the last show we did together. It was because the Muslims had militarily taken Christian lands for 400 years, and the Pope and the state were sort of the same. And the Pope decided, well, we're going to use the military to take back those lands. And we also pointed out in the last podcast that, and I want to reemphasize this, that most people did not have access to the Bible and couldn't read it for themselves, and pretty much were at the mercy of whatever their leaders told them the Bible said. We're sitting here with Bibles all over our homes going, why didn't they just read the Bible and know this wasn't the way to do things, right? They didn't have that luxury back then. And I guess my question now is, when the Inquisitions did occur, what was the relationship between, say, the church authority and the government authority, and how much of this was actually ordered by governments, not, say, the church?
Great question. It was a 1,000-year tug-of-war.
Okay.
So kings wanted to appoint their bishops in their country.
Okay.
But the Pope would threaten to excommunicate the king if he would, try to exert an independent bishops and so forth. And so you had this, there was, one King Otto, and the Pope excommunicated him, which meant that nobody could do business with his kingdom. He couldn't sell anything. Nobody would buy stuff from him. And so for 3 days, he stood out in the snow in front of the castle that the Pope was in and just stood there shivering. And then finally the Pope says, okay, I'll let him in. And then he forgave him and unexcommunicated him. And so there was this tug of war in England when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. The Archbishop was obeying the Pope and wouldn't recognize the divorce. And Henry VIII cans him, and he puts in an Anglican archbishop. And Sir Thomas More, who was the king's chancellor, and he supported Henry. But when Henry became Anglican, Thomas More stayed Catholic. And there's even, a movie of it. I think even Richard Burton starred in the movie. And he's, at first they're friends, and he's like, oh, come on, Thomas, why don't you? And when Thomas said no, he's like, okay, sorry, I got to get you killed. So now I wanted to finish my clock. So first you have the king, like Nimrod or Caesar or Nebuchadnezzar, and he's over the government and he's over the beliefs of the people. And then when the Christianity happens, and then Jesus says, rendered Caesar Caesar and God's God, and then eventually turned into bishops throughout the Roman Empire. And then sort of like today, you get a bunch of pastors together, and more often than not, the pastor with the largest church sort of gets deference, sort of gets, the last say. They're like, well, when I say this, well, what does the pastor of the really big church say? Well, that's sort of what happened. And Peter was the bishop of Rome. And so he would get the last say. And after a while, he, ended up becoming a little more important than the rest. And then the word Pope, which comes from Papa, which means father. And anyway, but you began to have a split between the king being over the government and the Pope being over the church. And then the Reformation happens, and the church goes through this tumultuous period of transitioning to a bottom-up movement rather than top-down through bishops. And it was facilitated by the printing press so that people could read the Bible for themselves. And then when the Pilgrims and Puritans come to America, they take their covenant church form of government bottom up, and they make it their civil government bottom up. But then it goes in reverse. You have this teaching after the First Great Awakening revival that says if you really become a Christian, you should withdraw from worldly things, including government. And so now you have true born again, biblically literate Christians withdrawing from the government. What happens? Well, non-Christians get involved in government, and they yield to their ambitions, and they flip the government from bottom up back to top down. They just can't help it. They want to be in charge. And then they're not just content with ruling the government top down. They can't help themselves. They want to rule the church top down. And they want to tell you when you can open up your church, how many feet you got to be distant, whether you can sing songs, whether you can have communion, and they're going to arrest your pastor if he doesn't do exactly what the government says. And then you're back to sort of an Antichrist scenario. And, but for most of world history, you had the government in charge of the belief system. And that's what highlights, in England, the Baptists and the Presbyterians and Quakers and how they had this movement of freedom of conscience that later came to America. But I'll get to that in a minute. So going through some important milestones in history, you have John Wycliffe, and he translates the Bible into English, not Latin. It was considered casting pearls before swine or taking God's name in vain to take the holy scriptures and put it into the common, what they called vulgar language of the people. And so John Wycliffe had to have some trials. There was a Pope Alexander V. He issued a papal bull against him. And at this time, the Queen Mother of England sent her at one of the trials of John Wycliffe. There's an earthquake in London in the middle of the trial. Everything starts shaking, and they all canceled the trial, and so like God was intervening. And then they finally, after a while, have another trial of John Wycliffe, and the Queen Mother sends his army on horseback into the cathedral, and says the Queen doesn't want you finding John Wycliffe guilty, and so they put him in some rural parish, and the printing press had not been invented yet, and he translates portions of the Bible. And it's all hand copy. And he teaches the people of his church how to read, and then they hand copy the Bible. And then they're walking around England sharing these Bible verses. Well, the organized church calls them idle babblers, and the word for idle babbler is lollard. And so they were Wycliffe's lollards. And then Wycliffe finally dies, and then they have another trial. And they dig up his bones and they hold the trial and find him guilty.
Now, when you say they, who's they? Is that the Roman Catholic Church?
It would be the church, yeah.
Okay, all right.
And so England is the furthest country away from Rome, and so they got to exert a little more independence. Where, for example, in 1527, the King of Spain sent his army into Rome and imprisoned the Pope for 6 months and pillaged. And so when Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain, the Pope's like, I don't want Spain to come in here and imprison me again, so I'm not going to recognize Henry VIII's divorce from the daughter of the King of Spain. But Henry felt like, I'm so far away from Italy that, I can I can have a little more independence. But the third time they take John Wycliffe, they have a trial with his bones, right, his corpse there. and they find him guilty, and then they cremate his corpse, thinking that if they burn your body, you won't be resurrected. That was one of the superstitions back then. But you could just imagine the trial. I mean, here's John Wycliffe's corpse. Well, what do you have to say to yourself? Answer the accusations. Like that.
All right.
Anyway, and so after John Wycliffe, right, he, in a sense, that was an inquisition. Is John Huss. So John Huss is in Bohemia, or the Czech Republic, or Prague. And years ago, I visited Prague, and it's a beautiful, beautiful city. It was taken right away by the Nazis and then the communists. And so they didn't have any battles there. And so their ancient architecture survived. And so it's a beautiful medieval castles and winding streets with, you can be at the top of the hill and go into a building. And the inside of the building, it'll have stairs and rooms and pubs and restaurants. And then you come out of the building, like, 100 feet down the hill, on the same street. It's just, it's a fascinating place. So John Huss is in Prague, and he starts preaching the Bible in the Bohemian language. And guess what? The whole country converts. Even the king converts. And the Pope doesn't like this. And so they have the Council of Constance in 415 AD, and they summon John Huss. And he says, well, I don't want to go. You'll kill me. And they promise the king of Bohemia that they're not going to arrest him. And so John Huss goes, he's having dinner, and then they bust in the room and arrest him. And I thought I wasn't going to be arrested. They go, yeah, but we don't have to keep faith with heretics. Oh. And since you're a heretic, we don't have to keep our word to you.
He's a heretic great. Because why? Why did they consider him a heretic?
Well, he was translating the Bible. And why
is that? I know it seems crazy to us today that why would any Christian denomination not want the Bible translated? Why did they not want it translated?
Well, then people could have their own relationship with God, independent of the church. Mm-hmm. And the church had the attitude that for you to have salvation, you have to belong to this particular denomination. And that if you're not part of this denomination, then you've lost your salvation.
I remember Jesus saying that somewhere. Maybe Paul. Who said that? Did somebody say that somewhere? I don't recall that, Bill.
and it's a little bit interesting because the Pope that had John Huss arrested at this Council of Constance, they decide that he's an illegitimate Pope, and so they elect a new Pope. But the first one didn't step down, so now they have two popes. And so then they decide to have the first two step down and elect a third pope. But the first two didn't want to step down, and the popes have their own armies. And after this council is over, they go back, and then they end up having wars, and then they end up. But the pope that had John Huss arrested actually was depoped in a turn of events there.
About what year is this now? This is prior to. So it's prior to Martin Luther then. It's 70 years prior to Luther, approximately, tacking the theses up. So it's just the Catholic Church is in charge at this point.
Right. And so they tell John Huss, recant of everything you've ever said and written. And he thought he was going to get a chance to debate and share his views and maybe convince. And they said, you can't talk. You just get to say one word. You either deny everything that you've ever said or written, or we kill you. And he goes, well, I can't deny it. So they said, okay, they put a dunce hat on him, one of those, little cone hats on him, and they march him out and they tie him up and burn him. Anyway, then we have, I mentioned Henry VIII, mm-hmm. and originally he was Catholic. And so he, at that time, is when he had William Tyndale killed. But then he became Anglican, and then he killed the Catholic Sir Thomas More. Then he killed Irish Catholics, and then there were Puritans that he killed, and then Presbyterians in Scotland. Fast forward, you have King Charles the second, and he has his Book of Common Prayer, and they're good prayers, but you can't make up your own prayers. If you feel like praying, you have to open up the Book of Common Prayer and read the prayer, because you could make up one that's wrong. And so the first time they read from the Book of Common Prayer at a church service in St. Giles Cathedral in Scotland, a market woman named Jenny Geddes, Geddes, she hurls her three-legged stool and hits the minister and knocks the book out of his hand. And then people start throwing stuff, and it turns into a riot. And so the king sends up his army to force them to read from the book and have his Anglican bishops. And so they call it the Bishops' War. Well, the pastors of these Scottish Presbyterian churches says, well, you know what? Let's just not meet in the church building. Let's just meet in a field. Well, guess what? The king sends his army into the field and disperses their meetings, and then he catches them, and then he kills them. It's actually called the killing time, when they would kill people that they caught in the field. And then they would even kill people that were hearers. So you could be a speaker, a preacher, or a hearer of that heresy, and you would get killed by the Anglican king because you were a Presbyterian Covenanter. Right?
Okay, so this Anglican denomination started by Henry VIII now is conducting inquisitions against other denominations inside of England?
Yeah. And so we got Henry VIII. I skipped ahead with Charles II, but we got Henry VIII. And then, but Inquisition, now there's a Portugal Inquisition of Catholics, again, going after Protestants. And then you have Mary the First. She's the daughter of Henry VIII, and she wants to bring England back under the Catholic Church. And so
she disagrees with her dad. Her dad has his own denomination called Anglicanism, and she's the queen now after him, and she wants to go back to the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And so she turns into Bloody Mary. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she killed about 280 Protestants between 1553 and 1558. And she's married to Philip II, the King of Spain. And he visits her like one time, maybe twice. And she evidently is not that pretty. And then she thinks she's pregnant, but it's a tumor, and she dies. But she killed what's called the Cambridge martyrs and the Oxford martyrs, and then you have Catherine de Medici, and she does not like the fact that 10% of France is Protestant, called Huguenot. And so she's a little more creative. She arranges a wedding of her daughter Margaret with the main Huguenot Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre. And it's a big wedding in Paris, so all the Huguenot Protestant leaders show up at this wedding. They're like, hey, we're gonna patch things up. Well, a couple days after the wedding, she has them pull chains across the streets of Paris so carriages cannot ride out of town. And she sends her men house to house, and they kill 30,000 of these Huguenot Protestants. It's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572. And then they begin to go out from Paris and kill them all across the country. And that's when a whole lot of them fled to colonies in America.
Now, Bill, what was the logic behind this at the time? I mean, does anyone write about it and say these people are heretics, and this passage here in the Bible says these people must die? I mean, where are they getting this? By this time, okay, this is after Luther, obviously, and the printing press. Some people have the Bible now. How do they justify this?
It's called divine right of kings. It's this idea that goes back to the King Saul, and that you have to believe what the king tells you to believe, or it's treason. So remember King Saul, and he's pouting that his son Jonathan made friends with David, and he turns to his soldiers and he goes, none of you soldiers care about me. And one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care. I saw David go to this town. The priest there gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, tell the priest to come to me. The priests show up. He turns to his soldiers and says, kill him. The soldiers hesitate. And Doeg the Edomite goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers were still operating under an old system where each individual had a personal relationship with God, and every individual is accountable to follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn somebody to death, and there's only one witness doeg. And so the soldiers are like, okay, king, you're telling me to kill, but I'm accountable to God, and God says there needs to be 2 witnesses, not 1. They're hesitating. They have a conscience. Doeg the Edomite says, king, I'm going to surrender my conscience to the government. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. Tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. Tell me there's no more male and female. Tell me kids can be furries, whatever. I'm a bunch of mush. When you blow the trumpet, I bow to your statue, right? And so it goes all the way back to Nimrod. Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said Nimrod wanted to build his tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And he made everybody in town bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. And he wanted people to fear his government more than fear God. That was Nimrod's contribution to history, is he introduced this idea of fearing the government more than God. God comes, and then God, confuses the languages, and they never finish building the Tower of Babel. But this idea is that the king is in charge of the belief system, the religion, and the government. And so Catherine de' Medici, she's the Queen of France, and she says, you got to believe what I tell you to believe. And now, again, Martin Luther starts the Reformation in 1517, and you have the Lutherans breaking away in Germany. But in their case, you had to be a Lutheran. And if you were like in Munster, which was one of the cities there, they had this group that were reading the book of Revelation. The one guy, said that he was, in charge, and ended up, having multiple women. And I don't know, it sort of devolved into a cult, basically. And so the town of Munster was surrounded, and then they captured the ringleaders and skinned them and put them in cages and hung the cages from the church tower. It was so the problem is you have freedom of conscience, but some take that freedom of conscience to start cults and even sexual immorality. And so this is the idea. And we experienced that in America. I know I'm about bouncing around, but you had, Quakers and Baptists, and they would be a covenant group of people. But then in the 1800s, now that we're a country that's not enforcing religion, you had these different cults that were started. One was in Oneida, New York. And it was this community where every man slept with every woman, and on a rotating basis. And the kids were born, nobody knew who the dad was. And it was like this chaos. And one of the people from that Oneida community is the one that assassinated President James Garfield. And then you got the Mormons, where they said you can, was it Joseph Smith had 19 wives? Yeah. It's like, oh, you can have lots of wives. And so wherever, if you get into this abuse sexually of women that happens, so that's the dilemma. We want to get rid of religious requirements. But then what happens, you got selfish human nature that wants to say, okay, I can do whatever I want. I'm going to go off the deep end. That's why we have, laws, because you'll have people selling children into sex trafficking for money. And say, well, I can do whatever I want. It's like, wait a second, we have to have some laws and this, but then you get back to, the scriptural laws that we're individually accountable to God.
So, by the way, when a Inquisition occurs, say in France, as you mentioned, against did you call them the Huguenots, the Protestants? Yeah. At that point, people might have had a Bible. They had to have known that there were times in the scriptures where the followers of Yahweh said no to the government. The Hebrew midwives, Rahab, the apostles. We must obey God rather than man. But they didn't make that connection. They said, no, what if the queen tells us to murder a whole bunch of people, we're going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the situation. And so there was it was political. So, so the monarch was, especially in England, the monarch was the head of the church and the head of the government. So your pastor could turn you in. In Anglican Virginia, everybody had to pay taxes to the government, and the government paid the pastors. And that's still the way it is in Germany today.
Sure.
Right. That's how Hitler was able to seize power. So in Germany, everybody pays taxes to the government, and the government pays the pastors. Mm. And so when Hitler was seizing power, the pastors' first thought was, are we still going to get our paychecks?
Right.
And Hitler says, if you behave, you'll get your paychecks. Well, they would gradually say, okay, get rid of that cross and put up a swastika, and get rid of the Bible and put up Mein Kampf. And there's photographs of the Nazis moving in and, demanding that they swear allegiance, in church to Hitler. But that happened because the churches were dependent on Hitler giving them their paycheck. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Eric Metaxas helped to reveal that Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up against that with what's called the confessing church. Seth Gruber has the White Rose Resistance, and it was these students that stood up to Hitler because all the adults had already caved.
Right.
And that idea in Germany of the church being silent ultimately goes back to the Pietist revival of the early 1700s, where you had this thought that religion is more than a state doctrine. It's a personal experience with Jesus, which it is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you have this personal experience, you're going to withdraw from worldly things like government.
Yeah, that's not what the scriptures say, but okay.
And so if all the spiritual people withdraw from government, who's left to be involved? But the less spiritual, right? It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Don't get involved in government because it's worldly. Well, why is it worldly? Because we're not involved in government. All the Christians have left, and there's a vacuum, and into it are drawn non-Christians. And now, to their credit, this concept allowed the Lutheran Pietists, called the Moravians, because they had a little place in a kingdom called Moravia. It allowed them to go to countries all around the world because they could go into the country and assure the Indian king or the African chieftain or whoever that we're not political, and so we're not a threat to you, so you can let us in and we'll evangelize, and we'll just make honest citizens, and so it helped them. But they didn't realize that in America we're a republic. And when you tell the Christians not to get involved, you're producing a negligent king, right? The word citizen means co-king.
And, as we go through all this, Bill, it really strikes me that if you had people that truly were Christians, because just because somebody says they're a Christian doesn't mean they are, even Christian leaders, right? It strikes me that if Christians truly understood the ethic of Jesus, that they wouldn't be commanding forced conversions, as if that's even possible. They wouldn't be involved in inquisitions. But on the other hand, when you look at the history of it, to kind of give us some perspective, I've read John Dixon's book called Bullies and Saints, and he takes a look at all of these periods throughout throughout church history. And he's quoting other scholars who say that when it comes to the Spanish Inquisition or the Inquisitions that went from 1100 all the way through maybe even 1800, the 1800s, the Spanish Inquisition went into, he said that the upper end estimate of people that were actually killed was about 6,000 people. Now that's 6,000 too many. We get it. But Dixon points out that the Inquisitions would not make the top 10 list of evils done by people over that period of time. Do you agree? In other words, he's saying that the sort of the common idea that the Inquisitions, where hundreds of thousands of people died at the hands of inquisitors, is false. Do you agree with that? Is that your view as well?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
The whole thought of, get rid of all religions. And it's like here, the Supreme Court called atheism a religion. It's a belief system.
Sure.
I mean, there was the case Torcaso, where they called secular humanism a religion.
Torcaso v. Watkins, 1961.
Yeah, and then there was in 1970, Elliot Welsh was a draft dodger as an atheist, claiming religious conscientious objector status. And the Supreme Court said atheism is a religion. It's a belief system.
That's right.
And it doesn't need to have a supreme being, right? It's Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, they're considered belief systems and religions, even though they don't have a supreme being. And so actually, it's atheism that is the most violent religion.
Explain that, would you? What do you mean by that?
Well, you look at communism. So now, first of all, Islam killed about 280 million people. You had Genghis Khan killed about 30 million. But you have communist China and Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. And this is different. Most revolutions just want to overthrow the government. This is to overthrow the culture. And so they wanted they burnt the oldest Buddhist temple in China. They tore down the great gates of Beijing, but they drove out all foreign influence, all foreign missionaries, all, Christians. And they killed 80 million people that were still holding on to old beliefs. And because they wanted to do something new, the CCP, the People's Republic of China. North Korea, that has an atheistic religion. Of course, it also has emperor worship in a sense. And then the Soviets killed an estimated 60 million, and they are atheistic. And so these are unbelievable numbers. And it's this idea, if there's no God, there's no eternal life, this life is all there is, and our goal is a communist society. And so if you help us achieve our goal, your life is worth something in our eyes. And if you're hindering our goal, then your worth goes down. And so it's sort of a toss-up, which is more violent, atheism or Islam. They would say that the communists are not afraid to die, but they're not in a hurry. The fundamentalist Islamists, they're like in a hurry. Matter of fact, in Islamist belief is that the only guarantee of going to paradise is if you die while you're killing infidels. That's right. Killing unbelievers. And
let me mention something about the interaction between atheism and murder, immorality. This is from John Dixon, his book, Bullies and Saints. I'm quoting. He says, "There is no necessary link between atheism and immorality, but it is equally true that atheism rationally permits a Stalin in a way that is not true of religion. Even the strictest inquisitor never imagined he was allowed to kill an innocent," unquote. And I'm writing something right now. I go on to say Dixon's point is a good one. While all people do evil, the Christian worldview has commands against it and an ultimate judge who promises to punish evildoers. Atheists have no objective moral commands and no ultimate accountability for evildoers. When a dictator believes there is no law or accountability beyond himself in this life or the next, it is not certain that you'll get a Stalin or a Mao, but history shows it's certainly more likely. And by the way, if you look at the Encyclopedia of War, ladies and gentlemen, you will find out, you always hear this, religion is the cause of most wars and all this. Actually, according to them, religion is responsible for 7% of all global conflicts in history. 7%. And of that 7%, if you take Islam out, only 3% of wars are caused by religion. Islam accounts for more than half of the wars caused by religion, according to the Encyclopedia of War. So it's just a myth to say that religion causes most wars. Most wars have nothing to do with religion. In fact, if you just look at the last century, virtually none of the wars, or very few of them, had anything to do with religion. World War I, nothing to do with religion. World War II, nothing to do with religion. Korea, nothing to do with religion. Vietnam, nothing to do with religion. Saddam invading Kuwait, nothing to do with religion. They have nothing to do with religion, and yet there's this myth out there that all these wars are somehow caused by religion, when in fact that is not the case. But we will admit, Bill, I know you will as well, that much of what was done in the name of Christ, whether it's through overzealousness in the Crusades or whether it's through some of these Inquisitions, it is the illogical working of Christianity, not the logical outworking of it.
Right. And so that's why you had in England the dissenters, the nonconformists, and these were the Baptists and Presbyterians and Quakers and the Pilgrims, and some of them are worth noting. The founders of the Baptist faith in England, 3 men: Thomas Helwise, John Smith, not the Pocahontas John Smith, but a different one, and John Merton. And they had the Newgate prison. And so in England, they did not feed you in prison. And so people would die in prison of starvation. And so John Merton was put in prison, and a friend brought him a bottle of milk, but instead of a cork, it had a wad of paper. And when the guard wasn't around, he unfolded the paper, took a splinter, dipped it in the milk, and he wrote out his pamphlets. No man should be persecuted for conscience sake. And the milk would dry. It's clear. He would fold it up and stick the paper in the empty bottle. The guard would take it. The friend would take it home and unfold it and hold it above a candle. And the heat of the candle would turn the milk brown. And they could see what he wrote and typeset it and print the pamphlets. And the guard was like, how's he getting that out of the prison cell? And so the early Baptists called it the milk of the word.
Wow. And
so Thomas Helwise died in the Newgate prison around 1616. And he says the king is not God. Therefore, he should only be concerned about actions and not beliefs. And then I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if the government can stand there on the day of judgment, believe whatever the government tells you. But if the government's not going to be there on the day of judgment, you are accountable to God for your own conscience. It's like, Kings didn't like that. They didn't want everybody having their own conscience. The king wanted you to believe what he told you to believe. And so the Baptist church, pastored by John Smith, has a group branch off, and it's pastored by John Robinson, and he's the Pilgrim pastor. And they're meeting in Scrooby, England, at the home of William Brewster. He's like a postmaster general of that area, and he's got a big estate, and they're having a Bible study. Well, neighbors would snitch, and the police would show up and would arrest them, and they would be put in jail, and then they'd get out, then they get arrested again. And then they decided to go to the Netherlands. So the Netherlands were 7 provinces that had an 80-year war of independence from Spain. And the provinces didn't always believe the same thing, but they were willing to overlook their differences to fight together against Spain. And so that overlooking of differences was tolerance. So the Netherlands was the most tolerant place in all of Europe. And it also had a little more immorality because they would tolerate some of that. So the Pilgrims decide they're going to flee to the Netherlands. And a group of them sell their property. They have their money. They arrange for a Dutch ship to give them passage. And so they're in the big city. They get on the ship. But before the ship takes off, the captain suspected something, robs them, turns them over to the police, and they're put in jail. And so another group of these Pilgrim separatists sell their property, and they arrange for a Dutch ship to sail up the coast. And they would be waiting in little rowboats. And when nobody's there, they would row out really fast and get on the boat. Well, the Pilgrims show up a day early, and they're rocking in the waves, and it's really rough. And the women say, can we just wait on the shore with the kids? And then finally the Dutch ship shows up. The men are rowing out there. They're stowing everything. But before they can come back, somebody snitched, and the police come over the hill and capture the women and children. And the Dutch captain says, I don't have an army with me. And he pulls anchor and sails away with the men. And you can just picture the women and children on the shore watching that ship getting smaller and smaller and disappearing over the horizon. And for 2 years, they passed these women and children from one court in England to another. Finally, a judge said, you didn't do anything wrong, go home. They go, duh, we sold our homes. So just to get them out of their hair, they put them on a ship, sent them to the Netherlands. They start asking around for other English, and they find out where their husbands are, and they get reunited. There's a happy ending to that chapter. And but then Spain threatens to attack. They decide to flee again. They were going to go to Guyana in South America. They heard of the perpetual spring, and it's always warm. But then they thought of what the Spanish did to the French Protestants that settled around Jacksonville, Florida, Fort Caroline, in the year 1565. So a bunch of French Protestants, about 300 of them, they come across, they set up their little fort, they got the Indians helping them, and the Spanish find out about it. And they surround the fort, and then they tell them, look, if you just surrender, we'll just move you someplace else. And so they talk and they decide to surrender. And then the Spanish says, oh, I forgot to tell you, we don't have to keep faith with heretics. So they take the men to the riverbank and chop off their heads and then sail away with the women and children. And then the Spanish found St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest continuously inhabited city in America. But what was before that was the French Protestants that were wiped out. So the Pilgrims decide they don't want to go anywhere near Spain. So they settle on Jamestown, started 14 years earlier. But providentially, they get blown off course to Massachusetts. Why is it providential? Because Jamestown had people starving, like 500 died there. It was, then Indian attacks and massacres. And so providentially, they landed in Massachusetts, and then Squanto came out of the woods and helped them. But what was a big deal was freedom of conscience. Mm-hmm. Now, the Puritans were persecuted in England. King Charles I said, I will make them conform themselves or I will harry them out of the land. And so beginning in 1630, about 20,000 Puritans flood into New England. And you have pastors and their little covenant churches founding cities. It's a unique period. Pastors and churches founding cities. And they would set up a covenant form of government in the city. Everybody's involved in founding the church and everybody's involved in founding the city. And so every church member is involved in politics. Matter of fact, the first election in America took place in Salem. So you got a group of these Puritans, they settle in Salem, they need a pastor. But since they're not part of the Church of England, they don't have a king, bishop appointed pastor, but they want to find one that they feel is God's will. And so they read in the scriptures, because they all can have their own Bible, and they see the requirements to be a pastor, right? Husband and one wife, have your house in order. And then they would pray and fast and try to see who they thought was God's elect or God's chosen. So the word elect means chosen. Mm-hmm. Book of Mark, it says, none would survive, but except the Lord shortened the days, but for the elect's sake, whom he has chosen, he has shortened the days. And so they thought, okay, God has already chosen somebody to be the pastor. We just got to seek him to find out who his chosen person is. And they wrote the name of the two pastors, right? They wrote them down and they passed them forward. And that was called an election. And so the first election in America was in a church. The goal was to find out who God's will is, but instead of God speaking through apostolic succession, through Peter and bishops, it's speaking through us, the people who can read the word, and it's a bottom up. And since they're founding the city, they would choose their leaders for the city. Okay, who has God chosen to be the mayor? And so they would all vote. And then that turned into the word federal is Latin for covenant. That turned into our government in America. And so these were founders of America that fled here because of freedom of conscience. It goes back to this idea that God loves you and he wants you to love him back. But for love to be loved, it must be voluntary. Love cannot be forced.
That's right.
The moment you would force somebody to say, I love you, they don't. It might be an outward thing, but they don't mean it in their heart. And so this idea of freedom of conscience was a founding principle in America. So they said, well, you Christians want to set up a theocracy. It's like, no, we ran away from that, right? We want to set up where the people have freedom. So we don't want dominionism in that sense. We want freedomism. So when they say, oh, you Christians, dominionists, you want to take control of everything, you're going to force, but it's like, no, you don't know. Don't you know any history? The founders of America.
They don't.
So here is the, James Madison wrote his Memorial and Remonstrance. And then he, together with George Mason and Patrick Henry, put together the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which says this: religion, or the duty we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. Therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. And that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. So it's Christian forbearance. It's that early church. Ben Franklin called it the primitive church, right? It's not Islamic forbearance or Buddhist or Hindu. It's Christian. And then Jefferson in 1777 wrote his original draft of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Now, you know Jefferson because he disestablished the Anglican denomination in Virginia, right? Remember, the king was the head of the church and the king was the head of the government. And then once we split from the king, they pulled a fast one and they just changed Anglican to Episcopal. And the word Episcopal means bishop, so it's the bishops. But it's the same structure. And you had people like Patrick Henry and George Washington says, look, it's worked. Let's just get rid of the king and keep it in place. But Jefferson wanted to disestablish it. And so the people against disestablishing it were called anti-disestablishmentarians. I remember that used to be the longest word in the English language, anti-disestablishmentarianism. So here's Jefferson. He disestablishes the Anglican Church and he introduces the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And in his first draft, Jefferson writes, Almighty God hath created the mind free, and all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of religion, who, being Lord of both body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do, but to extend it by influence on reason alone. It's like, why did God make us in the first place? He didn't make us to be robots. He made it for fellowship. He made us for love. And so he wanted to give us free will so we could choose to love him back. Some don't choose, but some do choose. And so our human experience is sort of a sorting out place. If you're God and you want to populate heaven, wouldn't you want to populate it with people that loved you and wanted to be around you, which means you would have to give them the choice not to love you, right? But so and then God has to hide himself because he's so awesome. If you were to see him, you'd respond instinctively. And it would be an involuntary response. And so he has to hide himself and he allows us to have this free will. So us being humans, it's this freedom of conscience is core. And so James Madison made an entry in his journal, June 12th, 1788. There is not a shadow of right in the general or federal government to intermeddle with religion. Their subject is, for the honor of America, perfectly free and unshackled. The government has no jurisdiction over it. So the government should not be involved. Here's Jefferson, second inaugural address, 1805. In matters of religion, I have considered that its free exercise is placed by the Constitution independent of the powers of the general government. I have therefore undertaken on no occasion to prescribe the religious exercise suited to it, but have left them as the Constitution found them under the direction and discipline of the state and church authorities by the several religious societies. So it's like, okay, government is not going to tell the churches. So America, we're different than what happened in Europe.
You know,
Jefferson.
Bill, I was listening to John Dixon on this very topic, and apparently Jefferson, if you go to his library and I can't remember what book it was, but he actually quoted Tertullian as the inspiration for his views on freedom of religion. An early church father. Very interesting because he actually has, he starred something in a work of Tertullian and it's in Jefferson's old library. And a scholar who John Dixon was talking to actually went and viewed this himself. So the seeds of all this, of course, are in the Bible and they're in the early church fathers. But when we look throughout church history, we see people getting away from obeying the scriptures. And Dixon is the one who said, when somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame? Right? You don't blame Beethoven, you blame the player. And so when somebody plays Jesus poorly, whether it's popes, whether it's Calvin who tried to kill people too, or, you know, it went both ways, Catholics and Protestants, Protestants against Catholics, Anglicans against, you know, whoever. When Christians don't obey Jesus, that's not Christianity. Christianity is Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Bill, we're at an hour and 15 minutes. Give us kind of a final thought. Wrap this up here. about the Inquisition, and then we'll give people a chance to get a book that you've written that will touch on this. But anyway, go ahead, wrap up your thought.
Now, that's why you're so good at this. I love that Beethoven example. That's great. You don't get mad at Beethoven; you get mad at the person playing it.
Right.
Now, I do want to extend a little positive thing. So, the Catholic history, you did have pushback within the Catholic Church. They had a concept called subsidiarity. It's a strange word, but it meant that the local should have the authority, not the person at the top. So everything that can be taken care of on a local level should be allowed to be taken care of on a local level and not be completely top down. And so there were, and then you had, Francis of Assisi in the 1200s, and the church had gotten very wealthy, and he stood up against that opulence and started a movement. The poor friars. But here's Madison. Madison introduced the First Amendment, June 7th of 1789. James Madison said, "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship." Civil rights of none should be abridged on account of religious belief and worship. Now, that was reworded to turn into our First Amendment. But here is Joseph's story, put on the Supreme Court by James Madison. And he writes this in 1833, "The real object of the First Amendment was not to countenance, much less advance, Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among the Christian sects," SECTS. And then Samuel Chase, put on the Supreme Court by George Washington in 1799, Runkle versus Weinmiller, said, "By our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion. All sects and denominations of Christians are placed on the same equal footing and are equally entitled to protection in their religious liberty." So this was a brand new thought. So here you had the millennium of churches in Europe, and they're saying, no, in America, we're going to take the original Christian idea that Jesus had, that Jesus never forced anybody to believe in him, so we can't. We're going to allow freedom for all these Christian denominations. Now, since that time, it got expanded to tolerate other beliefs, Judaism and then Islam. And many states originally forbade citizenship to Chinese. It's like, what? It's like, yeah, they were Buddhist, but we're not going to be one nation under gods, plural. But then finally they got tolerated. And then tolerance went out to the atheists and Satanists and the transgendered. And guess what? The last ones in want to kick the first ones out. So now they want to do an inquisition against Christians. And they want to say that you get canceled, you lose your job unless you embrace their trans agenda. Recently in Colorado, the House passed a bill that if the parents misgender the child, the state can take the child away from the family. It's ridiculous. What did you just say? Bizarre. They can indoctrinate the children at school with his trans agenda. And if the kid comes home and says, I'm now this, it's like, who told you that? Well, the school. And if you don't agree with them, they'll take the kid away. And so they're actually starting an inquisition against the Christians. So I want to, in recapping, you start off with the king, the Nimrod, the Nebuchadnezzar. He's over the faith and he's over the government. When Christianity comes along, you have Jesus not forcing anybody to believe in him. And that was the first three centuries. And then you have heresies, and then you got state doctrine. But then you had the Pope, in a positive sense, split control of the church away from the king. So now you have two different entities, the church and the state, with different leadership. They're having a 1,000-year tug-of-war. The Pope wants to excommunicate kings, and king wants to appoint the bishops. And then we have a Reformation, and the church side flips from a top down to a bottom up. Pilgrims and Puritans apply that to government, top down to bottom up. And that was the era of America's founding. And so America was dedicated to freedom of conscience, but with Christians pulling out of government because it's unholy, right? It's worldly. Who's left to be involved? but people with without values, and they become tyrants. And guess what? They're not content with just ruling the government top down. They want to go back to a Nimrod and rule the church top down and take away the Christian's freedom of conscience. And anyway, it's a fascinating study.
It is great, Bill. It is great. And before I tell people how to get more information on this, one final announcement I want to mention. The Cross-Examine Instructor Academy is this summer. It's the 31st of July, 1st and 2nd of August. I'll be your instructor along with many others, including Greg Kokel, Natasha Crane, Elisa Childers, several others. Go to crossexamine.org. We have a presenting track and a non-presenting track. It will be held in Charlotte, North Carolina. Go to crossexamine.org, click on events. You'll see it there. Also want to mention we're going to Israel, Jordan, and even a optional extension to Egypt in October. All that is under events at crossexamine.org. And we're expanding internationally, and we're going to need some help to do that. So in the next podcast, I'm going to tell you about how you can help us internationally to expand what we're doing all around the world. We're in 13 languages now, so stay tuned for that. Bill, it's always fascinating having you on. What book or books can people get? I know they can go to your website, AmericanMinute.com. That's AmericanMinute.com, ladies and gentlemen. You can get an email from Bill almost every day that has some great historical stuff in it that will help you today to live out the Christian life. But is there a book or two that you could recommend on this?
Yeah, well, thank you, Frank. Mm-hmm. One is called Backfired, A Nation Born for Religious Tolerance No Longer Tolerates the Religion of Its Founders.
Mm-hmm.
Backfired.
Backfired by Bill Federer.
Another one is 3 Secular Reasons Why America Should Be Under God.
Mm. Okay.
And so if you like having rights the government cannot take away, and you like being equal, then those are biblical ideas. They're not Islamic or Buddhist or Hindu ideas, right? And then one that is it's called Endangered Speeches, and sort of a play on words. And it's how the ACLU, IRS, and LBJ threaten free speech, and they want to take away the church's ability to speak on issues. But AmericanMinute.com is the website.
AmericanMinute.com, ladies and gentlemen. The great Bill Federer always has great insights and can tell a story of history. And if you don't know history, friends, you're not going to be able to govern in the future. In fact, Bill, I don't know if you've heard that old Soviet Union saying that the future is known, the past is always changing. And what they meant by that was if they could rewrite history, they could get people to behave a certain way into the future. And tragically, in America, we don't understand history. We don't know how we got here. And if we're talked out of the true history, we're given a revisionist history, we can toss away our most treasured traditions for secularism, and it's not going to end well. So you're a great value to the kingdom, Bill. Thanks for all the work you do.
Well, it's an honor to be on with you, Frank. You're brilliant. I'm always amazed at how much stuff you know in all the different areas, and I just want to encourage all the viewers to get behind Frank Turek's vision to continue to reach the world with this truth.
Well, thank you, brother. AmericanMinute.com. Bill Federer, ladies and gentlemen. It's always great having the great Bill Federer on. There he is. So, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget we're going to be at UT Knoxville on the 23rd. And then we're going to be out in Hawaii for the Unshaken Conference out in Hawaii. I want to say that is May 3rd. I'm checking my calendar right now. I think it is May 3rd. It is a Saturday. All the details are on our website. So, we rarely get out to Hawaii, as you can imagine. I haven't been there in decades, but Saturday, May 3rd, we'll be out in Hawaii for the Unshaken Conference. All the details are on our website. Oh, and we also have on the 28th, another edition of The Bible You Never Knew, Story Stitched by the Hand of God. That'll be aired live at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, April 28th. That's a Monday night. Tune in for another edition of The Bible You Never Knew. Okay, friends, great being with you. Lord willing, we'll see you here next week. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.